Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for week 3, the final week of the discussion of Havel's Power of the Powerless. I was fired for Eton for standing up to woke ideology, and Dr. Robillard left teaching at Oxford for similar reasons. And we've decided to go through a series of books outlining what we think are some of the main concepts that challenge woke ideology and ultimately liberalism underlying it. And we'll begin, as always, with a brief prayer. Let me just switch to the next slide and get rid of the 2 videos so you can all read it and join with us. Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom. Pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect. Dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father forever and ever. Amen. Now, as usual, we will start with a quick recap of the main concepts. I'll remove my camera because it's blocking 3 and 4. Havel suggests that what we have with what he calls the post-totalitarian system is really an exaggerated form of modern society. And these are the 4 reasons for it. This is what he calls the intersection between dictatorship and the consumer society. And this, for me, is probably the most disturbing of his insights. What he's saying is that modern society has totalitarian tendencies at its core. It's consumption-oriented. We all fall prey to trivializing temptations, and there's mass indifference. And last of all, but perhaps most important, there is the greyness and the emptiness of life. Dr. Robillard, from the previous 2 lessons, why is it you think that these are the 4 features that he singles out?
I think what he's describing, it's the way in which these things interrelate to alienate persons from what we all intuit as a default natural state of being in relation to ourselves, in relation to the family, in relation to nature, in relation to our local community, really in relation to the way that humans are. And that these things, whether it's consumption, whether it's a broad mass sense of civilizational automism and a lack of real thick bonds with persons, or thick sense of community, a thick sense of kinship or nation or citizenship. These things in aggregate pull against what we all intuitively sense as being the default way of being in the world. And I think that's what he's getting at, the attributes that pull against that want to return to an order of being that we would regard as natural and I would say oriented correctly.
Yeah, I think that's a profound way of putting it, saying that it breaks down the natural bonds between people, specifically the family unit and the village, the clan or tribe, and ultimately the state or nation that grows out of that. Because if those are dissolved, then you are at risk of then being absorbed into this homogeneous mass, which is ultimately what totalitarianism is about. And if we think about equality being a substitute for order, rather than hierarchy, you just level everything.
Hmm.
steamroller it, then that's the vision of society being presented. So it's that grayness and emptiness, but taken to the nth degree, so that we get
Hmm.
the loss of individuality that he was talking about last lesson.
Hmm.
Good. So those are four things to bear in mind as we proceed through the concepts for sections 7 to 10 to finish off Havel's essay. So ultimately, then, what we get from Havel is the sense that he's giving a warning to the West that our latent tendencies are heading in the direction of totalitarianism. And that is what the 20th century shows as well. Why did so many democracies end up as totalitarian dictatorships? Some people might be thinking that democracy and force, or democracy and totalitarianism, are opposites. But I found this quote from The Menace of the Herd interesting. The example was given of 10 cavemen, and 7 agree on something, 3 don't. And the 7 can just force the 3 into doing what they want with clubs or sticks. And the argument is that the rule of majorities, in combination with the employment of brutal force, is likely to be the most primitive form of government in the development of mankind. And when we look at the end point of these democracies that end up as totalitarian regimes, it's no different from the cavemen ultimately. It's off to the gulag with you. And the number of human beings murdered by their own government, so democide, would be enough to go around the earth 4 times. So democide is the biggest killer. And in the 20th century, it's more than in all the previous time of human history combined. So mass murder by government is the biggest killer. And most of these are atheist regimes, in which case the question ultimately is, on that worldview, what is even wrong with it? And those guys know that objectively there's nothing wrong with that. To bring it back to our humble greengrocer then, what can he do about this? We talked a bit about complying with the lie being a way of entering the game, playing the game, and also allowing it to go on. And Havel says that the greengrocer, simply by refusing to comply, by breaking the rules of the game, has disrupted the game as such. He's exposed it as a mere game. He has said that the emperor is naked. Tell us a bit more about this concept of disrupting the game by not complying.
Yeah, this is the moment that the greengrocer snaps, where something inside him. There's an existential moment where he just can't stand being complicit in this network of lies and falsehoods that he's since been complicit and actually endorsing. So he has this one existential moment of taking the sign down and no longer going along with the panorama that Havel explains. And in so doing, he's sticking his neck out. He's going against the herd. But in so doing, what Havel says is that he's no longer inhabiting the world of lies. He's not living in lies. He's living in truth. But in so doing, he is now incurring. He's knowingly incurring what that is going to mean for when the system is going to reflexively respond against him, and he does that because he can no longer tolerate in his soul to the complicity in the lies anymore. So now he's sticking his neck out, and he's fully expecting to see the reflexive brunt of the system responding to him.
Yeah, and the effect on that, on the other people around him, is profound. And the image from the fairy tale of the Emperor's New Clothes summarizes this, because once you see somebody call out a lie as a lie, it loses its power over people. You use the image that Havel had of the panorama and how everyone contributes to creating that. And once you see that one person has challenged it, it's easy for the scales to fall from your eyes, and ridicule, as with the Naked Emperor, can actually be a more powerful shock to the system than, for example, calm, rational argumentation, which I think is why we see so little awareness of any sense of humor when the regime is being attacked. So,
Mm.
satirists in particular, comedy is very tightly controlled because it fears laughter most of all.
Yes, yeah, that's an excellent point. Comedy and authentic art in general that is exemplary of the truth or is critical of the lives of the regime. Yeah, any authentic art, be it serious or comedic, is going to get, or beautiful, is going to get aggressively stomped out because it's so threatening in this sense, because it could, there's very much a danger of it causing a very quick tipping point. So to critique one single feature of the tapestry is to critique the totality of it, and that explains why there's such aggressive censorship and such aggressive social tamping down of speaking of truth or comedy or satire that critiques the existing regime is because the system, it is actually rather fragile in that regard if that type of tipping point can be reached.
That's it. And you see, because of that, increasingly literary classics being cancelled,
Mm.
because the way a work becomes classic is by transcending its own author's lifetime and the place of its production, because it attacks on a metaphysical front. So Shakespeare's plays aren't just about Elizabethan or Jacobean England. They speak
Hmm.
to us now because they go far beyond that, with insights into the very human nature that the radical regime would attempt to deny. So art in general becomes very dangerous because the artist is doing the same thing as the philosopher, just using
Mm.
different tools.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, the light of truth is coming through in a variety of ways. Uh, yeah, be it beauty or comedy or in Havel's case, political action. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's emanating. It's this the same fundamental ground of truth coming out through these uh, various rips in the tapestry of the panorama.
Yeah. And I think you see that with recent attempts to try to crack down on memes as well. So,
To crack down means, yeah, yeah.
yeah, online, the increasing restrictions on memes, I think, show this fear of satire at its most extreme.
Certainly, and I think there's also something very authentic about comedy and authentic laughter, where people really can't they can't convincingly fake laughter, and they can't suppress a really good belly laugh that when they're responding to something that's like, oh yeah, that strikes as true and funny. So in both of those regards, this is why I think leftist comedy it's so stale and so unfunny for the corresponding reason that you just mentioned.
Yes, thought just occurred to me that traditionally the king would have a court jester, and he's not afraid to be ridiculed. But I don't think we have the equivalent of a woke court jester. It can't withstand ridicule because it's too fragile.
Right, right.
Can
Yeah.
you think of one? Because the court jester who's allowed, the jester's privilege, he can mock the king and only he can. And the king doesn't mind other people seeing it. The joke's allowed to occur. I can't think of an equivalent nowadays.
I mean, there might be a fake controlled opposition sort of court jester, maybe, if I really thought about it. But it doesn't. Yeah, nothing really comes to mind right now.
We talked last time about the truth setting us free and anything other than the truth ultimately enslaving us, which is why, interestingly, the more power you gain in the system that Havel is describing, the less free you become because you become more deeply enmeshed in it. We talked about how the prime minister, for example, is less free than the greengrocer. And this explains what we've been talking about with comedy in particular. If the main pillar of the system is living a lie, then it is not surprising that the fundamental threat to it is living the truth. This is why it must be suppressed more severely than anything else. Now, this explains why one man can be dangerous. We talked before about Solzhenitsyn as one man, powerless physically against the Soviet Union, being exiled. But it's precisely because of this is the most dangerous thing.
Yeah, this also goes back to my example of the flight attendees on the flight 93 with the box cutter wielding jihadist, and everybody in their own mind is thinking this shouldn't be happening right now. Somebody has to act, but everyone is waiting on a first mover. But then the if a tipping point, if there is no leader and there's no first mover, then it's a collective action problem and nobody moves. But if there is a first mover, then there's a second mover, then there's three, then there's five, then there's 10, then they're all set. There's actually a phenomenon in game theory is referred to as a winner take all strategy, where this happens and this can be mathematically shown in large groups where there is certain tipping points and people will defect to certain groups when it looks like there's a likelihood of success. But short of the likelihood of success presenting itself, persons will remain loyal to the other side. So I think what is so dangerous to the regime is this tipping point danger, and that's why it reflectively needs to stamp out anything that could even come close to generating that tipping point.
Yeah. How to get to that tipping point and what the people involved in that tipping group would need to constitute a genuine threat, we'll talk about later. We've got a couple of questions. Interesting how flags and signs are almost a symbol of obedience in and of themselves, regardless of their color or content. The same applies today with rainbows and Ukraine flag panoramas. I think that's a good insight. You do see that with the COVID and the Ukraine panorama, Pride Month as well. It's exactly like the greengrocer's sign. And there are workplaces, there are communities where if they don't see that sign being presented, it's a black mark against your name. And if you do put the sign up, then it is contributing to the panorama in exactly the same way as the greengrocer's sign.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, we're all those examples I think are functioning in almost exactly the same social effect as the Workers of the World Unite sign that the greengrocer puts up. I think that's spot on.
And the second question, where does this tendency stem from? Is it the desire for order but corrupted? Can an area of sin be attributed? Yes, it's a desire for order. Remember Havel's point about the miracle of the human subject and our awareness of ourselves as somehow disjointed, that we've lost Eden in some way. We're all looking for wholeness. We want a return to integrity. Now, Christianity offers that, but only through the cross. And the temptation of all forms of ideology is that they give an easy route
Hmm.
instead. It ends up being hard in the end, it ends up in hell ultimately, but at least superficially, it's appealing because it appeals to our desire for wholeness and reunification. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Robillard? The desire for order but corrupted.
Yeah, that sounds correct. As Havel mentions in the beginning, that's what ideology does. It provides a an entire orderly worldview. It's a very easy entry way in which to organize one's life, and if one accepts that, usually through some version of sin or often some type of vice like envy, then that is it's a very orderly way to go about looking at the world. That there's whatever the bourgeoisie are oppressing us, or the some other version of the oppressor is oppressing us, and that is the totalizing conceptual framework that orients one's life and gives them some sense of purpose, some telos, some sense of justified grievance that permits any number of uh, of acts of wrongdoing. Um, Once one buys into that, it it generates a momentum that I think is very increasingly difficult to back off on, and I think that for a lot of folks might be the reason why they stay on the train, I guess, right? Where they stay on this ideological direction of travel, even though the absurdities are becoming more and more impossible to maintain, is because they initially said, "This is my direction of travel. I'm a progressive, and here we go." Like they can't back out of it because they committed from that beginning claim.
Yeah, that's it. And regarding a particular area of sin being possibly attributed to this, if in doubt, I would always go for pride, which Aquinas
Mm-hmm.
described as the beginning of all sin,
Mm-hmm.
because fundamentally, the appeal of all ideologies is the idea that you can somehow save yourself without God, without the cross. So they offer a man made salvation. It's an
Mm-hmm.
attempt to, in every case, Marxism especially, create a utopia, create heaven on earth. And that's the pride at the heart of it. I would go beyond just the seven deadly sins, though, and think about vices, effeminacy, for example, which is being deterred from doing the right thing because of the hardship that it involves.
Mm-hmm.
So, effeminacy can be to do with attraction to pleasure or inability to tolerate pain or hardship involved in doing the good thing. And let's say somebody is faced with the likelihood of losing his job if he does what the greengrocer does, doesn't say something, doesn't comply with the lie, and he thinks, oh no, I can't possibly lose my job. Then what's keeping him complicit is ultimately effeminacy because he doesn't want to take the hard route.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very much that. Um, Also, I think they're also in this set of reasons that where people are making this internal calculation to continue to remain complicit and silent. I think some of it has to do with an absence of historical literacy or of historical grounding, where the notes of this have been seen before, and I think without with an absence of a longer historical perspective, I think that is also what is making people more timid and more flaccid in these types of social moments, where they don't think it's that bad because they don't have a reference point uh, within history to look to.
Yeah. Whereas actually, it's 5 minutes to midnight.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And so it's this. I think so, an absence of historical of a wider historical perspective makes the the average person go, "Oh yeah, sure, it's bad, but it's not that bad." And you know, uh, a greater historical grounding, particularly in the 20th century alone, should alert people. Should people's sense of alarm should probably be heightened with that greater historical perspective.
And that's exactly the perspective that is often not taught in the modern education system. So people don't know that much about communist regimes. And I think there's a reason for that, because if they knew more, then they'd recognize the patterns better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
certainly, certainly.
ultimately, Havel gives us this one choice, which is that we can either comply or we can follow the path of the greengrocer. So the
Mm-hmm.
primary breeding ground for what might, in the widest possible sense of the word, be understood as an opposition in the post-totalitarian system is living within the truth. And his metaphor of the breeding ground, I think, is worth exploring. What does he mean by living within the truth being a breeding ground for opposition? Because you might think you're not doing much by just deciding to live within the truth, but he says something might come of that. What do you
Mm-hmm.
understand by the breeding ground idea?
Well, he mentions certain acts that one can do to live within the truth. There's just the greengrocer takes down his sign. He stops voting in elections that he knows is a farce. He begins to say what he really thinks on political meetings. He finds strength in himself to express solidarity with those whom his conscience commands him to support. So all these little actions, and this sounds very similar to Solzhenitsyn's prescriptions in Live Not by Lies. These little actions in aggregate can start inspiring other people. And he gives this example of this metaphor of a bacteria or bacteriological effect where these little actions of speaking truth publicly and in these social acts could spread like a bacteria to other persons, much like a breeding ground or a petri dish. So that I think that's correct. I think that's spot on in the ways that the individual within this tapestry can actually carve out a metaphysical space for speaking the truth and living in the truth, despite not having ostensibly the institutional power at the moment to do so.
Yeah, the idea of waiting until conditions are ripe for the bacteria to take full effect. I think that's an important point to bear in mind, because you might not be able to force it, but once things have gained enough momentum, and it might even be once the lies have gained enough momentum and pushed to the point of absurdity where the average person can see it clearly and feels the pressure of it, then you've got the right kind of conditions for the scales to fall from people's eyes, if you've already got a small number of people pointing it out, living by the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But if you haven't
Mm-hmm.
got the right conditions, then he's suggesting it's not going to work. If things aren't ripe for it, you'll just have to wait.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, eventually, collapse comes to all these regimes that aren't founded in reality ultimately. So if
Mm-hmm.
anyone's doubting the idea that conditions do eventually become ripe, I would say that history shows no, you're wrong. They do, but it might just take a long time, decades and decades.
Decades and decades of unnecessary suffering too, for things to finally right themselves. And yeah, it needn't be unnecessary suffering.
And yet it seems to be, as we'd expect as Christians, with our view of fallen human nature, something that happens again and again. After each
Mm-hmm.
collapse, something comes around, because this is inbuilt in human beings, the tendency to take this route. It's never
Hmm.
going to work, but the temptation is always there.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've mentioned a reflex reaction from the regime earlier. Havel says that the regime prosecutes almost as a reflex action preventively even the most modest attempts to live within the truth, as long as it seals off hermetically the entire society. It appears to be made of stone. I think we touched on this earlier, thinking about why memes are dangerous, why comedy is dangerous, why art's dangerous.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
this is interesting. He's saying that it really does have to be airtight, hermetically sealed. Otherwise, it's not safe. Why is it so important to appear to be made of stone? What impact do you think that has on people?
Well, I think in general, I mean, we talked about this before. Humans are we're social animals, and at times we're very much herd animals. And in general, it's not a bad idea to go along with the group most of the time. It's otherwise I'd be conducting firsthand experiments and trying to build all of social knowledge personally from the ground up. I'd have to be sticking my hand into fire to learn that it's hot. I'd have to be trying to eat every plant that I see and trying to figure out which one is poisonous and which one is nourishing. So in general, this outsourcing of social knowledge or decision making and going off the collective decision making of the group is a good idea. Uh, but when that goes awry, it goes really awry. Um, so for the person or the individual to start critiquing, let's say the collective social epistemology of the group, it threatens that entire structure. So for that structure to remain, the integrity of that structure remain coherent and to have legitimacy, it has to bat out or reflexively chase out any persons who are questioning or dissenting, because one moment of dissent threatens the entire epistemic structure.
Yeah, this is why I think ultimately seeming to be made of stone is simply an intimidation tactic. So the parameters of debate, for example, are
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
increasingly tightly controlled, so that there are sets of ideas, there are commitments that are beyond being challenged. I mean, one example I would give is that if you look at mainstream discourse, ultimately it's all about people arguing for different degrees of some kind of commitment to liberalism. There's
Mm-hmm,
no
mm-hmm.
challenge to that overall paradigm. And this gives the impression that that particular edifice is solid stone and there are no alternatives to it whatsoever. Whereas historically, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. If you look at the entire history of civilization, some of the ideas that we now take for granted as being unquestionable hadn't even occurred to most people.
Yeah, I'm looking this up right now. There's a great, surprisingly, it's a strange source to quote from, but it's a Noam Chomsky quote where he says, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum." So to me, that sounds like what you just described. Is that within the Overton window, there's fierce debate between, say, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris about various features about free speech and whatever atheism versus whatever it is that Peterson ascribes to. Um, and but outside of that window, outside of the really, as I think you've correctly described, outside of the presuppositions of Enlightenment classical liberalism, be it ethical, epistemological, or metaphysical, it's just regarded as not even worthy of serious questioning. So the present paradigm that mainstream conservative and liberal discourse is occurring within is unquestioned. And I think what Havel is getting at, and what you and I have been touching on, what Razard Legutko has pointed out, is that the paradigm itself needs to be questioned. And so what I think this discourse is representing is really paradigm level differences, not just discourse within an Enlightenment classical liberal paradigm.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. You described the problem really well. And a question on this has come in saying, in a world of appearances and opposites, can we hope that even though it looks like it's made of stone, that in fact it is made as weak as paper? Ultimately, yes, Havel is saying that because it's based on lies about human nature. It is fragile, and the fact that it is reflexively acting to defend itself shows that it realizes that as well. Otherwise, it would have nothing to fear. So, we talked about how eventually all these systems collapse. That's what history shows us. So, that's the proof that they're weak as paper. But this needn't be something that you have to publish a book on. Needn't be something that you have to be an intellectual to do. Havel sees it as very much the job of the ordinary man. So his description of living within the truth, he describes as being any means by which a person or a group revolts against manipulation. He talks about students going to a particular music performance, for example, or he talks about artists or tradesmen continuing to practice their jobs, sell their wares in ways that don't comply with what the regime demands. So it doesn't have to be merely an intellectual affair. And in some ways, it might even be stronger when it's embodied and non abstract. And you've made the point a couple of times about more localized, more communal living. And I think you're onto something there. What do you understand by refusing to be manipulated being not just the job of the intellectual?
Yeah, I think it certainly has to be something that is embodied uh, in practical action by persons, right? It can't merely be left to writing intellectual treatises or even official, political actors, but it's in everyday life, right? It's in everyday life. It's really internally within one's own conscience, moment to moment, where this battle of living within truth or living within lies is occurring. And then, as you say, it the way in which it takes form in everyday life is in these very mundane actions, right? It's one's choice of who they economically and socially interact with what music and art and information they consume or don't consume, with which institutions and organizations and groups they actively participate in and grant legitimacy to, and which ones they don't. Which acts of basic etiquette or language or styles of dress or comportment in the social world they take on are all ways of claiming certain metaphysical space in a way that pushes back against the 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 panorama, and these can all be ways in which people act to live in the truth and act as dissidents and a type of resistance that isn't necessarily writing a treatise or running for political office.
Yeah, I would give the example as well of parents reading their kids traditional fairy tales at
Mm,
bedtime rather
hmm
than whatever is being put out as the best way to mold the soft minds of children now, whether it's the latest woke Netflix cartoon series or books about kids with two dads. So the basic decisions that you make that form your everyday activities like that, that's a form of refusing to be manipulated too. Or if you've got a friend who has set up a business and it's a bit more of a drive for you to get there to support him and also pay full prices rather than mates rates, that is also a way of refusing to be manipulated. If the big woke corporation that can post something to your door for a much cheaper price is tempting you and you go for that instead, then that's a form of playing the game.
hmm hmm Something else just came to mind as two examples folks can look to as, I would say, examples of inspiration of this ways of living in the truth in a parallel way. I mean, we mentioned localism before, but if one looks up Doug Wilson and Moscow, Idaho, they essentially have effectively a localist Christian town. And all the businesses and schools and institutions and local organizations are all robustly Christian and on the same page. So no one's worried about getting canceled. You can cancel one or two people. The populace there, they don't care. The whole town doesn't care about being canceled. They just shrug their shoulders and move on with life. So I think localism uh, creates an anti-fragile and a robust set of persons and local institutions that are uncancelable and able to live in the truth collectively, not just individually. And the other example is Dearborn, Michigan. I mean, you have essentially a Muslim population that has taken the area over, and they all economically just buy and sell from one another, and they've carved out a Muslim enclave within Dearborn, Michigan, and they don't worry about getting canceled either. So I guess economic localism, I think, is definitely one of the ways in which we can all be more live within the truth in a more robust way.
Yeah,
With
the Muslim example is a great one because one of the things that they don't comply with is usury, which is huge. It's an often overlooked
mm-hmm,
point. Uh, they won't take the loans that Westerners will that tie them
mm,
into the regime in a way that the Muslims manage to escape. Hopefully, that answers the question about parallel policies and how we can create structures outside of the machine. It interestingly leads us into the next question, which is who are the main critics of Havel's work and what can we learn from their criticisms? Well, we were talking
mm,
about what we disagree with in Havel earlier. And if we think about the difficulty of creating a parallel polis of banks, for example, let's say you want to get a mortgage. What you're facing there is basically a cartel or monopoly of all the major woke banks. And there's no real entry point for somebody
mm-hmm,
wanting to set up a new bank. And I think you see that in a similar way in some of the education institutions as well. No one's going to set up a new Oxford or Cambridge. That's not going to happen.
mm-hmm. Right, right.
And it's not just funding, it's also to do with the momentum, the prestige that those kinds of places build over centuries. It's why they're so highly prized and
Mm-hmm.
targeted by the people who want to infiltrate them because
Yeah.
these things occur from the top down. People say, well, why are all the elite institutions the ones going woke? Because that's where it starts and it trickles down from there to the others.
Yeah. 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 It's It's a monumental undertaking. It's a tough nut. It's a tough nut to crack here. Um, I think that's spot on though in terms of your explanation of why it's so difficult to get the appropriate traction in these parallel institutions, because they're almost not deep enough or self-sustaining enough to get off the ground, because even a parallel bank or parallel app or parallel academic institution is going to be reliant upon what we refer to it as the substratum. There's some sort of substratum that is already largely captured by wokeism in some regard. So it's a question of how does one locate or build or revive elements of the substratum that is not captured by the wokesters. And I don't have an answer off the top of my head, but that's at least a picture of the problem that we're
Yeah.
facing.
Both our examples there were really to do with money, whether it's banks or big prestigious education institutions. And it's not a coincidence that Havel describes the consumerist society and trivializing temptations as being at least two of the features of modern society that lead to these problems. Because if you look at a community like the Amish, for example, they just do without equivalents to those. They do without equivalents to the big banks. They do without equivalents to Oxford and Cambridge. Now, they still have education, but it's not the same kind of thing. There's a sacrifice to be paid for living in the parallel polis. And the whole point is that people aren't willing to make that. In which case, fine, you can't have your parallel structure, because what you really crave is the one on offer, and it's going to get you because of that.
I think it's a combination of things, though. I think it's not just people craving the existing structure that they're in, but it's also, for most people like myself, that I didn't grow up in an Amish community. I didn't grow up homesteading in Utah. So it's at some point, I think for a lot of folks, it runs into a question of failure of imagination, of like, well, how do you pragmatically get from point A to point B? If one said, I do want to live in an Amish homesteading community that's largely self-sustaining and off-grid, what does that look like, right? What do those steps look like to get from point A to point B? I think that could be a good conversation as well, as to if you could make that look more realistic to people.
Yeah, the agrarian movement, the Southern agrarians, would be a good one to look at, because that was what they were all about. Okay.
Yeah, Wendell Berry, I think we want to get to at some
Yeah,
point,
yeah,
because I think,
exactly.
yeah.
Ultimately, though, whether you're going to pull off something like a parallel polis, or just be someone who doesn't put the sign up, just be someone who won't trade with, give money to a particular corporation, won't work for a certain company, Havel says that living within the truth becomes the one natural point of departure for all activities that work against the automatism of the system. And we were thinking about ways in which there are weaknesses in Havel's ideas, but this one seems relatively unassailable, because the fundamental decision is either the truth or the lie. And once you take a small step in either direction, you're pointed in the direction that it's going to take you in. And he says, look, you've got to start with truth, ultimately. We know what the point of departure is, even if we're not sure how we're going to get to the destination or what the route's going to look like.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Yeah, it's fundamentally it's a direction of travel. It's an orientation towards truth or towards lies, and yeah, it begins with the single act of internally deciding to not go along with with the lies, and then it takes the embodiment of finally speaking up, and then whatever happens from there, yeah, I think it'll be different for each person. But it begins with that one public act of no longer being silent and no longer being complicit. And I think for everybody, there's always a reason to put that off. Right? There will always be a reason for the greengrocer to say, "Well, tomorrow I'll take the sign down," and that can be one's entire life.
And it won't be much of a life either. This can feel like walking on water. I think the biblical story about walking on water is a really powerful one for today's times. But the important thing to realize, even though the waves look big and you're worried about drowning, is that the ship's going down anyway, even
Yeah,
if you stay
yeah.
on it. So there's an element of faith involved, but the idea that there's going to be a happy ever after for you if you don't live within the truth is absurd.
It is, and I think once again it's the absence of knowledge of historical precedent that has made people sense that complicity and further acquiescence, for further appeasement to the system as it is somehow going to leave them immune to the system eventually turning on them. And that type of allegiance historically has shown itself to never work, right? It's just, it will eventually eat you just as a coward.
Exactly right. Now, we began by thinking about some of the features of modern society that Havel thinks lead to totalitarianism, specifically this post-totalitarian bureaucratic system. And he has some thoughts about what kind of person is the ideal subject of these systems. Deracination means basically cutting off at the roots. The radix in Latin is the root. And Solzhenitsyn talks about this. To destroy a people, you must first sever their roots. And there are 4 features that Havel picks out. You have to be seduced by the consumer value system. Now, I think this is because money becomes your god, and then you become easy to control through that. You'll say whatever it is that ensures you will keep your job, for example.
Yep.
And then we've also got the idea of a mass civilization. Identity is dissolved in an amalgam of the accoutrements of mass civilization. This is the sense of trying to regain wholeness, but without genuine integrity. So it gives you a sense of belonging. It gives you the easy answers. It gives you something to identify with, and provides the answers to some of life's deepest questions, to your existential pain. But it's not a genuine solution. And the most interesting one for me is he says there's no roots in the order of being. Ultimately, this is to do with the fact that he argues that the ideology is a fabric of lies. But being rooted in the order of being, fundamentally, that's got to mean something to do with human nature and the family and that wider network. So you're not just an atomized individual. What do you think he means by order of being?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I'd say what is the proper nature of the human person, and as we've touched on before, Havel takes much of his political writing from the philosophical writing of Patočka, who was trying to rehabilitate some Aristotelian account of the world, or Aristotomist account of the world that points to man's nature as being fundamentally not an atomized Lockean individual, but that of being irreducibly social. And as you said correctly, we're rooted in the family. So that, at least in my mind, when I hear order of being, it hits those sorts of notes.
And that is a starting point for having responsibility for something higher than our own personal survival. Although, sadly, I would say that it's specifically the family that often is used as the pressure point to get people, because they're worried that they won't be able to provide for their family if they are exiled, ejected from the beast, and lose their salary, for example. But
Hmm.
again, no happy ever after point applies there, because otherwise you're just taking your family deeper and deeper into it. So family is something higher, but the idea that your own personal survival might not be the most important thing, that's hinting at sacrifice and hardship again, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, certainly. And I think that is certainly the condition of many folks within an assumed modernist, atheist, materialist paradigm, where if you stripped out God and you stripped out, and thereby all the metaphysical underpinnings of regard for objective morality or aesthetic beauty or transcendent truth, what you're then left with really is you're just managing appetites at that point. You're just you're just the amoeba in the petri dish trying to manage a way to move from the cold end to the warm end, and that's just is that person's existential condition. Also, all the higher order things, I think, drop away when one accepts an atheist paradigm. It's just a matter of time before those things fall, and then what's one is left with is just regard for just base instinct and personal survival.
Right. And Plato makes the point in the Republic that the city is the soul writ large. And Havel has a variation on that here when he says that the system depends on this demoralization, deepens it, is in fact
Mm-hmm.
a projection of it into society. So it's the spiritual condition you've just described there, writ large. This becomes the summum bonum, the supreme good
Mm-hmm.
of the society, because it's the only thing people care about. And that's the ultimate weakness that Havel pinpointed at the core of modern society, that means that it tends towards a totalitarian conclusion.
Yeah, I think that's correct, and I think this also gets back to your point about the discussion, the limits of acceptable discourse. Right now, it's between largely the Overton window. It's a description between atheist materialist socialism versus atheist materialist capitalism, and there's really these are all assuming a fundamental atheist materialist paradigm, uh, and we aren't looking at, and this explains how it is where you see something like woke capital joining hands with the highest levels of statism, and I think we just need to get out of that paradigm entirely.
Well, this is the line we're finishing with from Havel today when he says it's not about two differing political forces or conceptions,
Mm.
two differing conceptions of life. What you said there about getting out of the paradigm, that's it, ultimately. So you've got two superficially opposed parties within current mainstream discourse, but essentially they're just different kinds of liberalism. So capitalism, for example, is economic liberalism ultimately. And then that is an assault on the family, because it sees the individual as the fundamental unit of society. And then
Mm.
you've got, on the other hand, people with more socialist tendencies who are also opponents of the family. Marx famously said that communism could be summed up in one sentence: destruction of private property in the family. So they're both opposed to the kind of hierarchical vision that we get in the Aristotomist worldview that you've mentioned already, whereby the family is the main social cell instead. They both
Hmm.
threaten
Hmm.
that. So we're moving out of one paradigm into another with Phaser next week. And if people could start reading The Last Superstition, the first two chapters, I think, would be ideal by next lesson. Then this idea of a different conception of life, one that isn't committed to the same fundamental presuppositions that Havel says leads to totalitarianism, will be outlined clearly in that book.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue from Havel to Phaser, and getting deeper into what this Havel's appeal to the order of being might look like in a more articulated way.
Good. Looking forward to that. Thanks for taking the time to do this today. Appreciate it as always.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. Thanks everybody for for tuning in and following this discussion.
Any last questions to come in, guys? Otherwise, we'll call that for today. Thanks for the questions so far. We got some great ones. And thanks to everyone for tuning in as well. Remember, Last Superstition is the next book on the list, and we'll be running with that all the way through October, probably into mid-November, because there are so many concepts in there that are going to really challenge the way in which you've been taught. Um, for me, that book was one that made me realize how little I knew when I first read it in my early 20s, and I felt cheated by the education I'd had. Any other Havel books to read? Yeah, what we can do is, I think, begin with the next lesson on Phaser. Dr. Robillard mentioned Patochka earlier as one of Havel's big influences. And I think what we'll do is begin with about 5 minutes or so, just explaining some ideas that link the two of them, and then suggest some further reading for you to explore.
Mhm.
Okay, guys,
Yeah, I think that
great.
sounds good.
We will see you next week. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Later.
Bye.